Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to our midday keynote for the inaugural Gaming and Education Conference. So glad to have Dan White here. So glad to have some of you in the live audience. And so glad to have Brain Pop as a sponsor of the conference and Allison Levy as the co-chair. Allison did a great job organizing keynote speakers and presenters. It's been a terrific asset to the conference. Thanks to ASB Online and the American School of Bombay for their support and for Blackboard Collaborate. For those of you who are here live, this is your chance to indicate where you're participating from. Look to the left of the map. We're looking for the star icon. We're going to click on it twice and then click on the map. It's fun for people to know the time and the temperature where you are. I'm in Sacramento, California. It's 9 in the morning. We've been through almost half of our day already. And there we have Australia, which makes us international. Luke's at 2 a.m. Luke, where are you? You must be Australia there. How fun. Feel free to keep putting notes in the chat there, but I will move us forward to give Dan as much time as possible. Dan, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm really excited to be chatting with you all today from Madison, Wisconsin. I didn't put my cell on the map, but Filament Games is located here in the friendly Midwest. Yeah, so as Steve said, my name is Dan White. I am the Chief Product Officer and the founding partner at Filament Games. And Filament Games is a game development studio that exclusively develops educational games or learning games that are specifically designed for formal learning environments like the K-12 classroom. We've been at this for almost a decade at this point, so we've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work, and of course there's still a lot more to learn. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about why, from our perspective, after doing this for almost a decade, we continue to create games for the classroom, why we believe that games are an effective learning tool for formal learning environments. And then also what we mean when we talk about games, and then a little bit about how we do it. I'm not going to be talking for an hour, so there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. You're also welcome to interrupt me anywhere along the way with questions. I don't know that I'll actually be able to see it down on the chat because it's very small and kind of in my periphery. I guess I'll try to keep an eye out there from time to time and see if there's anything coming through the transom. So to start off here, I would like to introduce you to this technology called the textbook. So pictured here in front of you, the textbook has words and it has pictures, and it's really cool because you can look at it and these things enter your brain, and then you have the knowledge that was in the book and on the page in your head. And it's so cool, in fact, that we spend the majority of K-5 education making sure that kids can read, with the idea that if they can read, then they can go out and they can pick up any book in the world that has knowledge about any subject matter, and they can get it into their head. For the next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about why everything I just said is a really backwards way to think about this, and then how games come into play. So to illustrate this idea, I'd like to talk about students A and B. So both of these students can read, they're both literate, and they would both like to build a rocket ship, and they would like to go into outer space and land on the moon. So student A takes the more traditional approach, and he goes to the library and checks out every book he can find on manned spaceflight, rocket ships, construction, and orbital trajectories. And he diligently reads them all and tries to get all that information into his head. Student B, on the other hand, goes and plays a game called Kerbal Space Program. So for those of you who are not familiar with the game Kerbal Space Program, this is a game where you can design just about any rocket ship that you can possibly fathom. You can launch it into space subject to a very high fidelity and realistic physics simulation. You can experiment with orbital trajectories and try to land on different planets. You can pretty much set whatever goal you like. And you can learn through the process of trial and error what works well and what doesn't work so well. So for example, here we see a student learning that trying to re-enter a planetary orbit, a planetary atmosphere without a spaceship is not a particularly good idea. So at the end of this process, neither of these students can get to the moon yet, right? And I would say that A has something that we typically call knowledge, while B has something that we often refer to as understanding. Of course, A needs understanding, B needs knowledge. But my argument is that there are very different places in their learning trajectory at this point, and that B is in a better position, ultimately, long-term in her learning trajectory, based on the fact that she started with understanding as opposed to knowledge. And the reason for that is that, from my perspective, knowledge is assimilated while understanding is constructed. Knowledge is assimilated while understanding is constructed. So let's dig into that a little bit. So B, without any first-hand experience with building rocket ships or launching them into space or space travel writ large, doesn't have the mental model doesn't have a mental model that's prepared to receive the information that he's reading about in all these books. And so a lot of it simply bounces off harmlessly because he doesn't have this experience, this first-hand experience, this mental model to build on. And as a result of that, his acquisition of knowledge is basically a linear slog. It's really painful, it takes a long time. He gets some of it he doesn't get. He's gradually building up understanding through this process of acquiring knowledge. It's very slow and painful. So what happens when what happens when B hits the books after playing Kerbal Space Program? So I would argue that after playing Kerbal Space Program, she has this rich first-hand experience, which has created all of these really robust mental models that are prepared to accept all of that information that she gets from going out and doing the diligent reading. And ultimately, her learning trajectory skyrockets past days, both in terms of knowledge and understanding. So the basic idea here is that the order is really important. And I'm simplifying a concept that was proposed by academics Dan Schwartz and Dylan Arena called preparation for future learning. And the basic idea was this, that if you take a game experience and place it at the beginning of a learning trajectory, that you prime students to make better use of any sort of academic activities that come after that, whether it's a reading or a classroom discussion or any form of further inquiry. And this is a really important concept. It's important for another reason as well, and that is that slogs aren't any fun. So think about where A and B are in their learning trajectory at this point in terms of their attitude about learning. I would argue that B is feeling pretty good. She's had a lot of early success. Things have come naturally and fluidly and easily, and when she went to the books, when she hit the books, it all made sense, it all clicked. Whereas A just feels like he's doing a lot of hard work and not having a lot of fun at it. So B's highly motivated, A not so much. So this is in a nutshell why we exist, to build games for the classroom that deliver understanding and inspiration. And I would posit that if school did nothing but deliver understanding and inspiration, that we'd actually be in pretty good shape. Even if kids were bombing on tests, set aside all the politics, set aside all the funding issues, but if kids walked away from school with these concrete conceptual understandings about how the world works in a way that would let them go on and apply that knowledge, that understanding in other domains, and transfer it to other domains, and do things of value, that we have succeeded as educators. And I would say the same thing is true for inspiration. If kids leave school and they're excited about learning, they have a passion for learning, and they think that learning is fun, engaging, and interesting, then we have succeeded as well. If they leave school curious and excited about solving problems and learning new things of their own volition, then we have succeeded. So before we continue, I'm going to show you a video of one of the products that we're working on right now. It's called Flex Life Science. And it's a little bit advertising, and I apologize for that, but the reason I want to show it to you is because I want you to have some concrete images of the games as I talk about them, so that it doesn't feel so abstract. So Steve, if you can go ahead and cue up the video.
Cue up the video. I'm also going to put the link in the chat. If anybody has trouble, if the video doesn't show up immediately, click on the link in the chat to open it in your own browser.
Play. It can be fun, and exciting. It can be engaging and interactive. Why shouldn't we feel the same way about how we learn? Introducing Flex.
Okay, I'm going to bring us back, and Dan, it looks like you turned your mic back on.
Yeah, sorry, I jumped the gun there. Okay, and we're back. Okay. So now, a complete non sequitur to the second part of this talk, where I'm going to be talking about these four things. And the point of this section here is mostly to give you a sense of where, from my perspective, the space is at right now, and then also to dive into this question of what do we mean when we talk about game-based learning and learning games. So the first question, when will it happen, is relatively straightforward, because the answer is that it's happening right now. And one of the best examples that there is, from my perspective of this, is a program called iCivics. So this is a program that was founded by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor to make civics education a more prominent component of middle school education, which is a nice way of saying to make it so that it wasn't always getting the shaft, which it largely has in the past. And so iCivics is this large collection of game-based resources. I think there's about 18 or so games paired with curriculum that have achieved wide-scale adoption and use. So they're being used in all 50 states. I think there's over 40,000 registered teachers at this point, over 20 million plays on these games. So it's really exciting to see that a game-based learning program has been adopted at scale, is being used across the country, and is being used right now as we speak. Now, the caveat to point out here for those that are interested in the sustainability side of this space is that iCivics is free. These resources are subsidized by grants and other external sources of funding. So there's a whole other conversation that's probably better suited for an entirely different keynote about how to commercialize these types of materials. That's something that I personally am keenly interested in and be happy to talk to anybody about afterwards. But iCivics, despite being a free resource, stands as a testament to how valuable these resources can be to teachers and the fact they're being used right now. The other thing that's worth pointing out, too, is that there was a study recently conducted by Baylor University that demonstrated that the iCivics games as an intervention are effective. So they have the proven adoption and the proven efficacy, which is really exciting. So how do we do this? So I'm going to talk about, as an example, a game called Planet Mechanic. And in this game, aliens come up to you and they say, I would like a planet that has days that are as long as the equivalent of 3 Earth days because I want to throw a really, really long party. And then you manipulate the variables in the stellar system in order to produce a planet that has those conditions. So basically, we start with a learning objective or a set of learning objectives, and those can be standards-based learning objectives, but they don't necessarily have to be. And then we say, what sort of identities or roles can we put the player character in order to give them first-hand exposure and tinker with those learning objectives? What sort of systems, dynamic systems, can we create? And what sort of verbs, or we call them gameplay mechanics, can we let the player interact with in order to really steep themselves in those learning objectives? So say, for example, the learning objective is the student will understand how seasons work. So in Planet Mechanic, the way you do that is you would have an order from one of these zany little aliens that would say, you know, I want a planet that has seasons that are you know, that have some particular variable about them. And then the student can go in and they can tweak the parameters of this stellar system in order to deliver on that order. And we're less interested in having some sort of didactic introduction to how seasons work, and we're less interested in students understanding, you know, the vocabulary or the definitions about how seasons work. We want them, again, to have these conceptual understandings about how seasons work in order to address that learning objective. And we want to deliver that by giving them the system that they can tinker with and fail at and try again and fail and eventually succeed at through having this really deep understanding of how the learning objective actually functions. So here's the other side of the coin, and that is that at every step along the way, we feel like it's really important to be connected to the people that we're actually making the game for. So in this case, you know, Planet Mechanic is classroom teachers. And we have definitely been guilty in the past of creating, you know, inside of the walled garden, creating a really elegant game-based learning solution that there was no need for. So a solution to a problem that did not exist. So, you know, at this point, our focus is at the very beginning, at the conceptual stage for a project. What needs are we solving for the teacher with the game-based learning product that we're creating? And usually it has something to do with, well, if they use this game, they can teach something faster, or they can save money, or they can address some misconception, or they can show something that would be really hard to show in the classroom otherwise with the tools that they normally have at their disposal. And then the other big thing is actually getting all of our developers out into the classroom. Every time, I know speaking for myself, every time that I go into the classroom, I have these amazing learning experiences. It's really eye-opening. You know, so for example, just getting an appreciation for how much time, or as the case is, how little time there is to deploy these types of technologies. You know, so after the students go and get their laptops and then log in and sit down and everybody, you know, goes through the tutorial, by the time you get into the meat of the experience, that bell is going to ring in like 30 seconds. So again, you know, having a really keen understanding of the affordances and constraints of the environment that we are designing for is a really important part of this process, and it's one that we're still working on. It's one that we're still refining, and you know, I don't know that we'll ever get it perfect because, I mean, let's face it, the classroom, the constraints of the classroom environment are not perfect, right? Like in an ideal world, we would have all the time in the world with these students to teach the things that we want to teach them, and they wouldn't have to scamper off to the next thing when the bell rings. But that is the reality that we operate within, and that's the reality that we try to address. Okay, and then finally, we try to, whenever possible, measure the efficacy of what we're doing so that we can feel confident that when we give it to a teacher, we can say, this actually teaches what we say it's going to teach. And that can be anything from you know, really informal little pre-post tests where we measure the delta between the performance of the students before and after they play the game, to more formal, more longitudinal studies that are journal-worthy. We've done everything. We've done both ends of the spectrum and everything in between, and I think the important thing is that we continue to poke at that question. The caveat, of course, is that the more complex, I would argue that the better the game is, the more difficult it is to measure how effective it is as a learning tool. So, you know, by contrast, if you have a game that is essentially a series of multiple choice questions with high production values or pretty graphics, then you can make a very clean declarative statement about what the student knows and what they don't know, because at the end you'll have a report that will say they got this many right and this many wrong. Well, with a high quality game where there really are no right versus wrong inputs like that, it's not that dichotomous or simple, it's much more complicated to make a determination of what a student knows or what a student doesn't know. It would be, for example, like as I think about evaluating my performance in my job, it's a very complex job that involves a whole bunch of different interacting systems, and saying that I got 4 out of 5 right today would be impossible, right? So our goal in this case is to deliver reports to the educators that have meaning and have value and are actionable, but at the same time to not pigeonhole ourselves and basically dumb down the design so that we can create really, really clean assessment reports. I hope that makes sense. So in a nutshell, make a game about higher order thinking skills, conceptual understandings, more difficult to measure, but still worthwhile. The second thing is that we think it's really important to deliver what we call a whole product. So, there are early adopter teachers who we've seen take our games into the classroom and they're just like, thanks, got it from here, and they go off and do amazing things with it. The reality, of course, is that most teachers just don't have the time to think about, or the bandwidth to think about, creating an entirely new lesson plan to accommodate this cool new technology that we would love for them to use. And so we've been working a lot on building out an editorial function that allows us to build curriculum materials that go along with the games that suggest activities, discussions, labs, readings, etc., that the students can do before and after the game to extend the game experience and really make it work in the classroom. Now, going back to what I was talking about before, in terms of preparation for future learning, why else is this important? Well, because the game itself, as we discussed, is really just a primer. And think of it in terms of like potential energy. Like we've created all this potential energy, and if we don't have any activities in the classroom after the game, then we're basically just letting that energy dissipate, which is a real shame. So, the idea is that the students come out of the game ready to build on this really context-rich, really visceral learning experience, and that's the time when we need to strike. So the best, I'm very fond of this analogy. I think about the role of curriculum and games and how they fit together. That is the cookie and the milk. So a lot of times when you see curriculum materials and games paired together, they sort of feel like one feels like a bolt-on to the other. So for example, you have a situation where like the curriculum and the game were developed in silos and they're both about the same thing, but they don't really reference each other at all. So from our perspective, it's really important to make sure that they feel like a cohesive experience. Like the things that you're doing in the game are the things that you're doing in the curriculum and the lesson are explicitly building on what you did in the game. And so the reason I like to use the milk and cookies analogy is that, at least from my perspective, like you don't chew the cookie and then swallow and then swig the milk and swallow. You put some cookie in your mouth and put some milk in your mouth and you get it all up in there swirling around, and they complement each other, and the experience of the cookie enhances the milk and the experience of the milk enhances the cookie. Okay, enough about milk and cookies. Let's talk about what we mean when we talk about game-based learning. And the reason I want to spend some time on this is that across my time in this space, I've seen a lot of people say, games do this, games don't do this, game-based learning is good for X, it's not good for Y. And my concern with that is that all games are very, very different. They deliver very different experiences in very different ways. And so at a certain point, I hope the level of literacy in this space gets to the point where we can have conversations about specific types of games that do specific things as opposed to games writ large being something or not being something. So the first example that I'll use is a game called Eco Defenders as an example of the primary role that I hope is clear at this point that I feel games should play, which is to drill deep into a particular concept and engage students with higher order thinking skills, as opposed to, say, just covering content or content knowledge or vocabulary. So in this game, Eco Defenders, what you do is you design an invasive species, and your goal is to compete with a native species for a particular ecological niche. So you basically design the species, you unleash it, you see what happens at the end, you see all these reports about how well your species competed with the native species. And through this process, which is sort of this iterative experimental process, you see the reports and you go back and you tweak your your species and you try again. The thing that happened that was really cool was that we were collecting data, gameplay data from the pilot students who were using the game, and this one report came in and said that this student had created an invasive species that was more effective than the developers of the game thought was even possible. And they looked at it and they looked at the traits that the student had designed, and what they had essentially done is they had recreated the feral pig phenomenon. So they had designed an invasive species that was as effective, that basically had a lot of the traits as one of the most effective invasive species in the history of invasive species. So here was this really cool emergent gameplay feature that suggested that the student had this depth of understanding about this content, about this subject matter, that would be very difficult to get from just reading about it in a textbook. So again, coming back to this idea that games are really good at drawing deep, really good at covering conceptual understandings that can then be built upon later through readings and classroom discussions and other more traditional activities. So one of the other, so here I'm going to talk about a spectrum from small in scope to large in scope. And I think it's important for people to understand that the scope of the game actually has a pretty significant impact on the teaching methodology that you would use to incorporate it in the classroom. So here's an example. What you see on the screen right now is a game called the Radix Endeavor. The Radix Endeavor is a massively multiplayer online game. Without digging too far into that, what that basically multiplayer means, you're playing with other actual people in the virtual world. Massively means that there's a whole bunch of them, and that it's a persistent world that you can log into and log out of, and come back to over and over again, that there's hours upon hours of gameplay and hundreds of quests. So it's a really big game. On the opposite end of the spectrum is a game like Satisfaction. The only purpose of this game is to deliver a conceptual understanding of how fractions work. And that's it. And there's one activity that you do in this game, and that is you slice up shapes of increasing complexity in order to create a target fraction. So, you know, Satisfaction probably takes about 20 to 30 minutes to play. It fits inside of a classroom period, no problem. Radix is something that you could play once in 30 minutes, but you'd be hitting the tip of the iceberg, and it's really meant to be consumed as this sort of long-term, longitudinal experience that you come back to over and over and over again, probably some of the time in class, probably some of the time out of class. So the teaching methodology that's required to implement and integrate a game like Radix into a formal learning environment is completely different than the methodology that would be required to integrate a game like Satisfaction. Okay, so another spectrum is the spectrum from hard skills to soft skills. So one thing I think that's cool that's happening in the learning game space right now is that more games are starting to explore those softer skills, despite the kind of historical emphasis on STEM. So here's a game called Resilient Planet, and in this game you are an ocean scientist and you're forming hypotheses, conducting experiments, collecting data, and then using that data to make scientific arguments about how this ocean ecosystem works. And so this was a game that was designed to teach, to explore hard skills and analytical thinking, and yet inadvertently had this one section in the game where, in order to determine what a shark eats, you put a hose in its mouth and you pump water into its stomach, and that makes the shark vomit up the contents of its stomach, and then you can analyze what it's eaten and create a data point. What we weren't anticipating is, when we went in and did the classroom pilot testing, is that a whole bunch of students had this really strong emotional and ethical reaction to this methodology of collecting data in a virtual environment where no sharks were actually harmed. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that in the real world, this is considered the ethical way to collect the data. What they used to do is they just killed the shark and cut its stomach open and looked inside. So all of a sudden, in the classrooms that we were pilot testing, and we started to have these unanticipated teachable moments around empathy and the ethics of scientific data collection, which was really cool. Here's another spectrum, fantastical to pedestrian. So this is a game called Fuzzy Chronicles that is a game about Newtonian physics, where you're using real Newtonian physics in outer space to save these adorable and fictitious fuzzies and fantastical little creatures. And the cool thing about this is that, you know, the fictitious environment gives you, let me go back here, gives you this really, really compelling play space in which to learn about Newtonian physics. The caution, of course, is that whenever you create a game that takes place in a fictitious environment, you have to be careful about misconceptions. Like, where does the real stuff, the, you know, quote unquote real stuff that we're trying to teach end, and where does the fiction begin? The fiction being the part that is just designed to add engagement or make the play space more compelling or interesting. So that is something that we have to be very careful about. On the other end of the spectrum is a game like Backyard Engineers. In this game, you're on planet Earth doing very pedestrian things, literally building catapults to launch water balloons and bullies in your backyard. And so you might think, well, okay, so we're outside of a fictitious space, so no concern about misconceptions. But that's not true, because what we essentially have here is a simulation, and every simulation, no matter how high fidelity, is a lie to a certain extent, right? So, in fact, when we're making games that take place in real-world environments, we almost have to be more careful, because you know, we have to have, and this is, I think, an important teachable moment that teachers can have, or teachers can discuss with their students when they're playing a game like this, and that is that, you know, when you're engaging in any kind of simulation of some real-world phenomenon, it's always imperfect, and you have to be cognizant of where the game mechanics are iconic and where they are literal. So a good teachable opportunity, but you know, obviously something that has to be thought about carefully before you implement any game in the classroom. You know, a screenshot of Backyard Engineers. And then the final spectrum that I like to talk about here is the spectrum where, on the one hand, you have learning games that look and feel just as you would expect a commercial entertainment game to feel. So it looks like a game, it plays like a game, it sounds like a game. And then on the other side of that spectrum are games that I think still fall under the umbrella of learning games and game-based learning, but don't really look or feel like games. They're games that are maybe informed by game design principles. They're games that maybe deliver playful experiences, but they're not really games per se. So an example of that is a project that we're working on right now called Discussion Maker. And Discussion Maker is a speaking and listening tool designed to facilitate classroom discussions. It's designed to build scaffolding around the classroom discussion process so that students do things like take turns and use evidence and things of that nature. So these are, while Discussion Maker is not really something that I would qualify as a game, I would say it still belongs in this ecosystem of game-based learning because it is a playful experience and because it is informed by game design best practice. Okay, coming down the final stretch here, let's talk a little bit about what games are not. And this is, you know, this is the part of the presentation where I get a little bit soapboxy. So I apologize in advance. Candy-coded multiple choice questions and gamification. So games are, let's start with the former. So game-based learning is not multiple choice questions with pretty graphics. It's also not gamification. It's not traditional content surrounded by points and leaderboards. And it's not about just, you know, quote unquote covering content. So why not? So the risk whenever I think you go that route is that you're inadvertently making the statement that the value add for the game technology is that it makes it fun. Is that it creates this layer of engagement, and that's it. That's all it's about. It's like the content is what we care about, and the game is just this layer, this wrapping around the content that makes it more palatable or easy to swallow. So as we think about this concept of fun, you know, it's relatively innocuous, and I'm not going to get up here and say I'm against fun, because I'm absolutely for fun. I just think it's problematic in that it often gets positioned in contrast to learning. So, like, I think a lot of times when we think about educating kids, we have this little crush on fun, and then we think of learning as something that's a little more ugly and unpopular and kind of gets in the way. And in many ways, we're trying to circumvent it and say, you know, we want the learning to happen, but we want them to be having so much fun that they don't even realize that they're learning. which I think is a shame, because good learning experiences are some of the most enjoyable, meaningful, rewarding experiences that you can have. So here's the danger, is you end up with a quote-unquote game that looks like this. And that is a game where the gameplay mechanic and the learning objective are fundamentally divorced. So basically what this game, in this game you solve the multiplication questions, and then if you get them right, then your spaceship advances. And the message that this game is inadvertently sending to the player is, look, we're really sorry that multiplication is the pants, but you got to learn it. So to make it a little bit easier, for it to make it a little bit more palatable, we're going to add some pretty graphics and give you this goal of winning this space race. So the race is the incentivization, and the multiplication is the tax, if you will. Now, the advantage of doing it this way is that it's easy, and as we mentioned before, you get really clean assessment data if that's what you're after. But if you go all the way back to what I would consider the beginning of this movement, this game-based learning movement, you start to see this schism, you start to see this dichotomy between games and developers who think of games as who believe that the gameplay mechanics should not be separated from the learning objective, that the purpose of the game is to deliver a conceptual understanding, the purpose of the game is to deliver higher thinking skills, to deliver these sort of authentic, meaningful experiences as opposed to just shown practice. So this will suggest maybe it's not so much fun versus learning, and maybe they're not mutually exclusive, and maybe they're not even mutually agnostic. And in fact, if you believe in what Jim G says, he'll tell you that even if you look at commercial entertainment games, the parts where people are reporting that they're having fun are the parts where they're learning something new or experiencing some kind of new challenge, or doing something they haven't done before. And then in fact, when they stop learning new things, when they stop being challenged in new ways, they get bored and they disengage. So in Reach for the Sun, which is one of the games that you saw previously as part of our Flexible Science Suite, as I mentioned, your goal is to build, so you start as a seedling, and your goal is to fruit as many seeds as you can before the end of the season, before winter. And what we create in order for you to engage with learning objectives is a system where you're dealing with photosynthesis, you're dealing with the resources the plant needs to collect in order to grow and fruit different things. You're making strategic decisions about what parts of the plant to grow at different times. And the fun, if you would use that term in this case, comes from trying to master this system, right? Trying to get better at the system and understanding how it works. So again, the gameplay mechanics embody the knowledge that we want you to learn about plant anatomy and function, and the fun comes from mastering that system as opposed to answering questions about it. This is still problematic, however, at another level, and that is that this concept of fun is really subjective. So as we look at any given group of students or gamers, they all have very different tastes about what they enjoy in gameplay. So some of them might enjoy board games like Settlers of Catan, some of them might like casual games on their iPhone, and some of them might like hardcore JRPGs. And then even building on top of that is that if you look at the commercial entertainment game industry, and their only objective is to make it fun, and they're well funded, they have millions of dollars and really long timelines, and still, despite that ability to focus just on fun, the vast majority of them fail the vast majority of the time. They don't have to worry about meeting learning objectives or standards or technology issues or classroom constraints or anything like that. So it seems kind of weird to say that, well, we're going to do all that stuff plus we're going to make a game that's really fun on top of that. So I would advocate that we kind of break up with fun, kind of a fun, it's not you, it's me kind of thing. And with the idea that what we're after is something that's a little bit more meaningful than fun, that sometimes flies under the banner of fun, but actually as we dig into it, it's something a little bit different. And what I'm talking about is the type of experience that you have when you watch a really good documentary versus a summer blockbuster, or go to a really awesome museum versus an amusement park. And you can certainly describe those experiences as fun, but the better terminology is probably that they're meaningful, or that they inspire you to want to, they get you interested in the space and inspire you to want to keep learning more about it. So here we are, full circle, back to the original premise, that what we're after here when we create games for use in the classroom is that we want to deliver inspiration, we want to deliver the kinds of deep, transferable understandings, conceptual understandings that will have legs far beyond the classroom. So in closing, I'd like to say one final thing, and that is I'd like to talk about failure. So the two games that you see on the screen here are games that never saw the light of day. The one on the top left is a game called The Roots of Our Government. The game on the bottom right is a game called Body Commands, where you're learning about the body systems by manipulating them. Both very cool games, both very cool ideas on paper that just didn't work out in practice. That when we played them, we either felt that they weren't effective at teaching, and they're too confusing, or for whatever reason, just didn't feel right. And the reason why I bring these up is that I feel like we're at a pivotal juncture in this space where, it's 2014, and still when we talk about game-based learning, we're still sometimes talking about, multiple choice questions that are dressed up in nice clothes. And I feel like at this juncture, it's really important that we distance ourselves from that part of the space and say, okay, making real games, making good games is really hard. And there's, it's littered with, the space is littered with failure, or failed experiments that didn't work out. But if you're not failing, you're not innovating. And collectively as a space, let's push for quality and let's push for innovation. And what we'll get is some combination of failure and success. But the important thing is that we can build on top of the successes and take this space in a very new, sustainable, and interesting direction that I think will ultimately have a really powerful impact on education. And that is everything that I have to say today. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me about.
Dan, do you want to take questions?
Yeah. Of course.
So if you have a question, you can raise your virtual hand, or icon over in the participant box, or you can just grab the microphone, click on the talk button, or put it in the chat. The game only subscription based.
Our film game only subscription based. So in contrast to the idea that you would buy a game and have a perpetual license to it, yes, the idea is that you purchase it and then you have a 1-year license to it. At some point we'll probably roll out longer term licenses, but so far what we've heard from teachers is that they would actually prefer the shorter license because they don't want to get committed to something that's sort of frontier and unique and innovative just in case it doesn't work out or funding situation changes the next year. That's a good question. Other questions? I'm going to take one here from the here so I can.
And we'll be hearing later. And then there is a little bit of feedback there. I don't keep your mic on, so there's in the audience because he's on.
How would you help? Okay, so how would you help teachers make the argument to their administrators that this type of learning isn't valuable when that is the kind of data they're being asked to provide? Okay, so when I think Barbara, when she talks about this type of learning, she's talking about the gamification and the gamified quizzes that deliver this really easy to measure, clear-cut data. You got me, Barbara. That is the question, right? It's like, these are the pressures that teachers are under. This is the data that they have to deliver, and this is, as I mentioned before, and as everybody on this session knows, all these things have implications that extend all the way down to funding. So I guess what I would say is, I'm certainly not advocating for throwing our hands up and saying, well, it's just too complicated, we can't deliver you any data that's meaningful in order to do assessment, formative, summative, or otherwise. I guess what I'm advocating for is we acknowledge that good games are inherently complex, and say, well, what sorts of information can we extract from those gameplay experiences that will be useful to teachers and that they can pass on to administrators or parents or whatever stakeholders there are that they need to validate the activity against. And I'm very confident that we can build out reports that do demonstrate the activity is valuable and that learning is happening without necessarily boiling it down to 5 out of 6, right? And what that actually looks like is, from my perspective, what you get is a progress report that says, here's the various different activities that happen in this game, and here's how each of those activities is aligned to the standard that we're trying to teach, or the learning objective that we're trying to teach. And here's evidence that the student spent time with this particular activity, and that they completed this activity to some level of satisfaction. But do I think that the report could ever, replace the teacher's intuition about what that student knows and doesn't know and where they're at? No, I think it's really more, I think that the purpose that it primarily serves is that at the end of that class period, when all those students run off at the bell, you can see, okay, well, Johnny's over here and Susie's over here, when that would have been nearly impossible to see just from walking around the classroom and observing. So I think it's less about saying, well, this student is getting everything right and this student's not, so much as it is about, these are the experiences that this student had with the game, which I can use as a point of evidence to say that they were exposed to learning objectives or standards X, Y, and Z. Okay, so from who is someone to show? Scrolling back up here. What's the next question in the queue here, Stephen? Oh, okay. Is it? Sorry, my scrolling functionality is limited here. Okay, so we have from Anita Rigby, what inspires your game design? What books, resources would you suggest for game design beginners? Great question. So our game design is definitely inspired in part by what we observe in the classroom and what we glean from talking to teachers. A lot of times it's just a process of coming up with an idea, writing it down, prototyping it out on a piece of paper, or maybe even digitally, as the case may be, and then testing it to see what happens. And I'm a firm believer that the best game design is actually just a product, of a whole bunch of iteration. So in an ideal world, we would have endless time and endless budgets for each game, and we could, come up with a hypothesis at the beginning about what we think is a good game, and invariably learn that there are certain pieces of that are good, but we have to strip all this out and add this over here. And of course, over the course of doing a lot of iteration, actually arrive at something that is effective teaching tool and is engaging to play. The reality, of course, is that we're always on a fixed timeline and a very fixed budget, and we do as much iteration as we can in the time that we have. So I think the design process, the quality design process, is less about getting it right the first time, just dreaming up some really great idea that just works, so much as it is iterating on that idea and refining on that idea in response to the testing that you do within those constraints. So acknowledging that you only have a certain amount of time and a certain amount of money. As far as books, resources, I've seen, last time I looked at a game design book was quite a while ago. Our designers have a whole stack of them over on their desks, and I'd be happy to, if they follow up with me afterwards, I'd be happy to connect you with one of the members of the design team, and they can tell you what's contemporary. Okay, so from Luke Bryan, hi Dan, I quite often teach one-off classes at my university. Can you recommend any tools or resources to create games for a class like that? Teach one-off classes. I'm actually not sure what you mean, so I'll keep scrolling and see if there's clarification down below. Yes. Game start mechanics, scratch. Okay. Okay, so basically game creation games or game creation tools. Let's go look at the question. This is create games for questions like that. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think those types of tools that Allison mentioned are a perfect place to start. I also know of a tool called GameFruit that I think is a little bit lesser known in the U.S. Because it's not made here, and I don't think it's used here pervasively yet. But that's an HTML5 based game creation tool that I've tinkered around with, and it's pretty high quality. I also just think that you can derive a tremendous amount of value out of just having students engage in the game design creation process in a low-tech way. If your goal is to have engineering be a component of the experience, then obviously having it be digital is an important part of the experience. But I think there's a tremendous amount you can derive just from having kids or university-level students engage in game design around something that you're trying to teach. They also, through that process, I think you just learn a lot about production management principles and what it takes to collaboration, teamwork, creativity, et cetera, and what it takes to have a group of people come together to make something relatively complex under constraints. Okay. Any other questions, or any that I missed in here? Okay, so Peggy asks, so you want, and actually I don't know, maybe this is a response to something else higher in the thread. But what I'm saying is, you want games that can be played completed in a single class session. And that is an ideal. But I think the more realistic outcome is that the students get far enough in that they have a meaningful experience, and then ideally have access to the game outside of the classroom so they can keep on playing on their own time or of their own volition. Or oftentimes what we'll recommend is that you come back to the game over, several times over the course of a week or over the course of a unit, separated by activities or labs or discussions that relate to the game. And one of the reasons that we really like that approach is that, you have, each time you kind of get deeper and deeper into the game, and B, you have an opportunity to highlight particular parts of the game that relate to particular learning objectives or particular parts of the unit. So when we build curriculum around the games, we design them with the idea that each day you're going to do a certain part of the classroom dedicated to gameplay and a certain part of the classroom dedicated to some activity that builds on the gameplay. Okay. Any other questions? My email address is... Oh, I was just going to say my email address is white, just like the color, at filamentgames.com. Anybody is more than welcome to hit me offline with follow-up questions about any of this stuff. I'm always happy to talk about it at length, particularly if there are teachers, which I'm pretty confident there are in this session. If you're interested in talking about pilot testing or have feedback for us about what we're doing or ideas for things that we could do better or differently, we love hearing that stuff. So yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Great, I'm going to turn off the recording. Thanks everybody. Thanks Dan. Terrific.